Conservative nonprofit group PragerU released a cartoon of abolitionist Frederick Douglass seemingly taking a dig at the Black Lives Matter movement and presumably its demonstrations that swept the country in 2020. Take a look.
Children, our founding fathers knew that slavery was evil and wrong, and they knew that it would do terrible harm to the nation. They wanted it to end, but their first priority was getting all 13 colonies to unite as one country. The southern colonies were dependent on slave labor, and they wouldn't have joined a union that had banned it.
Are you okay with that?
I'm certainly not okay with slavery, but the founding fathers made a compromise to achieve something great, the making of the United States. It was America that began the conversation to end it. But Leo is correct that big problems need to be approached very carefully. Have you kids heard of William Lloyd Garrison?
No. Nope.
He's an abolitionist like me, and he and I used to be friends, but we aren't any longer. We don't agree how to solve problems. William refuses all compromises, demands immediate change, and if he doesn't get what he wants, he likes to set things on fire.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds like you know the type.
Yeah, we've got that type in our time.
Last month, Florida's Education Department approved adding PragerU's material to its supplemental curriculum this school year, meaning a teacher can pull from it without any fear of reprisal. Critics say the platform, which produced videos titled "Was the Civil War About Slavery?" and "The Inconvenient Truth About the Democratic Party," is rife with misinformation and is too biased for public schools. This has set off an interesting debate because PragerU is very openly doing what so many conservatives have criticized from the left, which is trying to create propaganda that is adopted by a school system, and successfully, in this case, it has made some pretty significant inroads. Does this conflict at all with feelings that teachers and parents should be the ones that drive curriculum as opposed to for-profit groups that are funded by, I know you don't like this comparison, but groups like the Koch brothers that have their own kind of business and corporate agenda that aren't necessarily in the best interest of kids' education?
I should note that I read the Slate article about this being added to the curriculum. It's not, again, it's you're allowed to use videos from PragerU. Not all of them are controversial the way this one is. This from Slate's perspective, Slate says that some of them are just about, you know, like how the Electoral College functions and other civics-minded lessons that don't have as much of an agenda. Clearly, there was an agenda here. But I mean, I guess I would flip that question back to you. What if, you know, this video is available in cassette form or something, sitting on a shelf of the library, of the school's library? Should they take it down?
That's an interesting question. Should they take it down? I don't know that I think that it's a problem to take it down. Well, let's start here. There's a question about whether or not materials that are inaccurate should be taken down. And inaccuracy was part of the basis of the criticism of some things like the 1619 Project, remember? Mm-hmm. And so you could say that was a censorship campaign against 1619 where people were trying to get it out of schools and things like that. And the people who pushed back said, well, no, we want it to get taken down because it's factually inaccurate. It's been fact-checked by these historians, et cetera. So I would say similarly in this case, framing Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist, as sympathetic to the choice of founding fathers who were slaveholders in not matching their personal lives with their ideals. And then framing in the context of the Revolutionary War, which was a rebellious uprising where things got burned because people didn't like it, saying that that was a good thing, but people who would want to do the same for the freedom of enslaved people who were beaten and raped and kept living like animals for dozens of generations of their families is both offensive and inaccurate. Moreover, saying it's worth it to suppress your abolitionist ideals for the sake of America being founded is very ahistorical, especially to the 20,000 slaves that ran away to help fight with the British because the British were promising freedom. And obviously, many thousands of people would prioritize their personal freedom over the abstract formation of a country in which they were enslaved. So I would argue that the narratives here aren't just sort of biased in a way that I personally don't agree with politically. They are a distortion of history that I think, frankly, does not belong in the school. But I'd have to look at other clips and judge each of those differently.
Sure. I mean, this is a fantastical premise because kids from the future are interviewing Frederick Douglass about what he might have thought about events.
Well, I don't mind the
before
premise. The premise isn't the problem. It's taking a real-life historical figure because you obviously understand the esteem, the credibility of using an actual historical figure, and then misrepresenting his politics in a way that makes politics which many people in a contemporary context, and I would argue in a historical context, would consider to be promoting inequity and maybe even racist. Using someone who is an abolitionist to say those kinds of things wraps language that would be more easily identified as pernicious.
I mean, if I was to identify what I thought was a distortion of the video, sure. It's not true that the founders were of mixed view. There were some of the founders, including John Adams, who were totally against slavery. There were others who thought it was like a necessary evil. There were others who were all for it and didn't want it to go away at any time. And it is correct to judge collectively how they handled slavery as massively hypocritical, given the way they're writing gloriously about freedom and equality, et cetera. And that there's no need for that to be controversial. There's no need to not acknowledge that. And they were going a little soft on that there. So
yeah,
I think
agree.
It's fine to criticize that. It wouldn't be a teaching aid I would use in my classroom. But I mean, to the point you raised earlier, again, the only way we're going to solve these very toxic battles over what exactly the curriculum should be is just going to be more choice in education. Yes, I want the parents and the families to use schools that reflect the values they want their kids to be taught by, rather than having this forced on everyone.
Well, given that most Americans can't afford a $400 emergency, much less shifting their kids into a private education system, I do think that parental guidance is ultimately what's going to resolve this sort of thing. Because when I was growing up, before, let's call it wokeness, schools, my education was considered to be much more conservative than my parents would have wanted for me. And I knew that because my parents were involved in my life and they taught me history at home. Previously, before there was any CRT or any effort to include the role of Black Americans in American history, even at a point in time, what we're talking about now, where Black Americans were a full 1/5 of the population, there was an understanding that you had to have your own independent curriculum. It's why, in part, we value historically Black colleges and universities so much, because it was the only time that Black people got to learn about their own history. The internet right now is going crazy with memes from this brawl that broke out in Montgomery, Alabama, that was a race war in part. We're not going to get into it, but a group of a Black security officer was beset by some white boat owners, and a bunch of other Black people came to his defense. One of them used a folding chair, and only because the lessons that we learned about Black inventions, like the folding chair, ask any Black person, we know what we invented. That there's a bunch of memes on the internet precisely because that was used in the brawl.
Scuba Gooding Jr. has been trending on Twitter for me for 3 days.
100%. 100%, because one Black guy swam across the dock to come and help with this fight. But whatever you think about that aside, I think there is a value in learning about the culture. And every other group living in all the countries across the world get to live about their own particular contributions to history. And Black Americans have felt for a long time that our contributions are excluded from the mainstream curriculum. So coming from that perspective, I have an expectation of having to learn about my own people and my own cultural contributions, not in a mainstream context. I'm not sure that's how it should be. But if it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight every time you want to simply acknowledge, let's say, the horrors of slavery, then I think that if the detente means everyone just go back to your own corners and learn about those kinds of facts in your own home, then that's what it's got to be.
But to be fair, the more, I think, thoughtful, coming from the right, concern about the curriculum it wasn't so much, the CRT ideology is, I think, not the correct kind of way to describe what the problem was. It was more coming from DEI, not even from actual curriculum makers, but from diversity consultant type people. And there's some of this in activist educational training that is, again, along the lines of, individualism and achievement and our white people aspects, and so we should expect minority students to fail because that's not their values. That you do, I've seen videos of activist educators talking about those things. I find it abhorrent, and that's what thoughtful conservatives were trying to purge, almost using like civil rights law from education.
I think that they had a much stronger point there, which is why I think that kind of anti-wokeness and stuff was on the ascendancy, and why that was such a good kind of topic for conservatives in places like Virginia that are these kind of like more purpley zones. I do wonder what's going to happen if we keep going into the direction that people like Ron DeSantis are doubling down on, with language about slavery where we're talking about the skills, focusing more on the skills learned by the people who were enslaved than the horror of the enslavement itself, in such a way that is basically alienated the only black elected Republican in Florida and other black Republicans across the state. I mean, if you're in a point where Briahna Donald of the Freedom Caucus is saying you've gone too far, I think you're going to also be in a position where you're alienating a lot of Americans who would agree, obviously white kids shouldn't be told you're inherently evil because you're white, to the extent that that was happening. That's obviously wrong. But saying that Frederick Douglass actually was like A-okay with slavery going on as long as it meant that America could be formed.
Well, he literally says in the video that he's not okay with it.
But sometimes you got to make compromises for the greatness of America as a nation.
Yeah.
I think that's where you're getting to a line.
I'm not a scholar of Frederick Douglass. He was a more conciliatory figure, I think, than even in comparison with William Lloyd Garrison. Right? That reflects a genuine disagreement they had in what tactics were. I'm not saying it was correctly portrayed in the video, but there's not nothing there to a debate among those two people on what was the best way to move toward the abolition of slavery, right?
I don't think characterizing Frederick Douglass as saying slavery was less of a priority, abolishing slavery is a lesser priority than the creation of America, a state, a country that enslaved people many years longer than England did.
Sure.
Which took much longer to abolish slavery. I know this is another fun talking point that I think I've seen in the PragerU context as well, that America was the first country to get rid of slavery, which is such a patent lie that is repeated so often in conservative circles. I don't even know what to do about it.
It's not accurate. I've not heard that said very often. It's not accurate.
Oh, I hear it a lot. I had a debate with Charlie Kirk last year, or the year before, where he said that to me. But the fact of the matter is that I definitely would be very skeptical if you could find anything that Frederick Douglass ever said that would suggest that he would prioritize the formation of America as a country that would then go ahead and enslave people for another 100 years over substantive freedom for black people.
Sure. Sure. I think I'm not saying it's correctly represented or portrayed in that video, but he did, I think, he was a free speech absolutist. He was all about, he did not fear debate or letting the people making the pro-slavery argument do that so that they could have debate. He had utter faith in his views and his cause to win out versus the more, I guess, militant strain of William Lloyd Garrison. That's my understanding. I'm not an expert in either of these figures.
In 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a keynote address at an Independence Day celebration and asked, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" It was a scathing speech in which Douglass stated, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn."
Yeah, I as I said. Yeah. But that doesn't mean there wasn't okay. There was still a difference of opinion on how to tactically bring about the end of slavery between the two figures.
All right.
That's what was being gotten at there. Well, we discussed the Florida Byron Donalds, Ron DeSantis spat yesterday in our Kamala Harris video, I believe. So check that out if you want to hear more from us on that, and more rising right after this.